Hello, everybody. It's really nice to see you all, meet you all on a Friday. Today, the agenda I made for us is I am going to very quickly give you all a sense of how I got started with public scholarship, um, including as a graduate student. And then I am going to talk about two innovations in public scholarship, but I am going to ground them in the work that I do, which is on homelessness and housing research. But I do think they're very widely applicable. And that's why at the end of this presentation, I won't just leave space for Q&A, but I want to start workshopping ideas that people have in the room. So maybe with permission from Tanya and Carly, it's at that moment we could stop the recording. I just want to also respect the privacy of people at the end who might want to share their ideas, but maybe don't want them recorded.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let us know.
Okay, great. So getting into it, so I think we should start with the definition of public scholarship. I'm sorry I didn't put it on the slide. I was just prepared to kind of talk and also have some information on my slides. But thinking about public scholarship in a nutshell, it's essentially doing research with the public for the public good. And the way that how I got started with public scholarship really, I think, emphasizes the ways in which if you're going through a graduate program, you're learning how to do research. So I really wanted to do public scholarship with the public for the public good. But going through my graduate program in the very beginning, I was very much being trained to be this like independent researcher. And so how I started with my public scholarship was very much in that model that I think where maybe a lot of us are familiar with if we've gone through or are going through a graduate program. And so doing my work on homelessness, specifically in San Diego, wanting to map the field, wanting to understand the impact of recent federal and local policy shifts. I thought that I would do this like public scholarship with the public by collaborating with community partners, which in the work that I do, especially in grad school, we're all of the nonprofits that were tasked with running shelters, running transitional housing, running permanent supportive housing for people experiencing or exiting homelessness. And so I very much started my work as a graduate student. I always knew I wanted to be a public scholar, but I very much started it in this model of public scholarship means collaborating with community partners, talking with them early before I do my own research to understand their needs, and then using the trust that I've built with them to help gain access to participants. So for example, getting to understand why it is that certain folks are very disconnected from homelessness services. I had meetings with one nonprofit, people assisting the homeless, and then not only did I get a sense of what they thought was going on in terms of why certain folks are experiencing unsheltered homelessness or really disconnected from services, but then I used my connection to gain access to finding participants for my dissertation. I shadowed them as they went out into the riverbed to talk to their clients, and I got to meet people that way to do my own interviews for my dissertation. So that's how I got started with like this idea of part one of public scholarship, working with the public. Is in grad school, I very much started by just trying to like collaborate with community partners to really understand their needs and to gain access to participants. And then on the other hand, like doing public scholarship for the public good, the way I got started with this work, as Tanya said, it was very much informed by Scholar Strategy Network, which I'm happy to talk about later during the Q&A, more on what that is. But in a nutshell, Scholar Strategy Network is a national network of scholars interested in public scholarship. Being someone who was interested, I was their grad fellow for a few years during my PhD program. And I learned a lot from them. I learned about how do I then translate what I've learned through my research into action, into policy action, where I'm really trying to get better policies in San Diego, maybe in California or nationally if I have the reach or if it's applicable. So I learned about media engagement. I learned about how you kind of use use press releases to get information out there to the media, how to like talk to the media. I learned how to write policy briefs and op-eds. And I learned how to do direct engagement with policymakers as well. So like I've gone to City Hall and given public testimony. So I just want to give you like kind of a sense of the beginning of this work, how I got started as a graduate student. And we'll kind of unpack how some of this is kind of like traditional and where we're going in terms of like innovative work at the Homelessness Hub now. So these traditional methods work. I, as a graduate student, being lucky enough to already work for the Homelessness Hub where I work now, working separately on their safe parking program analysis, I saw an expansion of that program. And I'm sorry, that should say safe parking, not safe sleeping. Safe sleeping is a different program that I am now investigating. So I saw from public testimony I gave at City Council on our research, and from an op-ed that I wrote together with my two colleagues. I saw the direct policy implications of our research. The city listened to us, they expanded the program. It's got several more locations now, including one for families. And it has one lot that is 24-hour access because of our research. I'll just give you that one example for time. So I've seen that this traditional method works. And I noticed this really early at the end of my graduate program, as much as I was really jazzed about doing this public scholarship, working with the public, having my research translate into a public good, I noticed that my traditional approach to doing public scholarship wasn't centering the voices of those directly impacted by homelessness. I also noticed that my traditional approach, I'm actually, being honest, I'm now starting to see, I'm 2 years out of my PhD program now. I'm 2 years into my postdoc. And I'm really, really starting to take notice now that my traditional approach to doing public scholarship may not actually be enough in this moment, where research in general and research on homelessness specifically is under attack. And so this is going to bring us to the meat of my talk. So thinking about innovations around these two issues I had with the way I was doing public scholarship. One innovation I've already been lucky enough to implement and to continue to work on at the Homelessness Hub. And the other one I'm just starting to work through right now with my colleagues. So thinking about this first innovation, this desire to really center lived experience, embed lived experience, I was able to do this at the very end of my graduate program. I think this is kind of relatively early, but I won a summer grant for like kind of like community engaged research at UCSD that allowed me to collaborate with some lived experience advocates for 3 months. And so I got to like dip my toe into what does it mean to actually fully collaborate with people with lived experience of homelessness at the end of my graduate program. And now at the Homelessness Hub, I've been very fortunate to be a part of starting to institutionalize this approach to homelessness research through our Homelessness Experience Action Research Training, or our HEART Fellowship, where, so unlike the 3 months I had as a grad student, this is a year-long training program where our fellows received paid compensation at the level of a graduate student to learn how to do research on homelessness with us. And then now they're embedded in all of our different research projects at the Homelessness Hub. And so before I talk about lessons learned from doing this work with lived experience researchers, I just want to give a little bit more context. So I'm assuming like the audience interested in this talk, a lot of you are going through grad school or recently emerging from grad school. And so you're familiar with this sort of like conventional model of research, where degreed researchers from outside of the community come to design, conduct, analyze, and report the results of research. And as I was kind of mentioning in the way I started my own public scholarship, this is also very true in public scholarship. And I don't think it's, I think it's just the way we learn how to do research in grad school, right? That we're supposed to be these independent researchers, right? A lot of our credibility in the traditional ways that we're evaluated as graduate students or coming out and being postdocs or assistant professors is really wrapped up in the independent research that we've done. And so it kind of bleeds into people starting their public scholarship. And I totally like, and I did a lot of that myself. I still do it. It depends on like what projects I'm on. But in this model, including in like traditional public scholarship, people most affected by an issue are objects of study rather than the co-producers of knowledge. And so what I was trying to start to do in grad school with limitations, right, of time and money, but what I've really gotten to do since in a much more satisfying way in my postdoc is to engage a research justice model, right? So working with lived experience researchers, and again, in my case, with my topic being homelessness, this model recognizes that those most affected by an issue, so again, my issue being homelessness, they're experts, and it grants equal access to and control over information that impacts the community. So I do want to highlight that research justice is born out of participatory action research that's historically been used by grassroots efforts here and abroad to combat colonization, racism, sexism, environmental degradation, etc. So it's important, it's only fair to spotlight that this isn't necessarily innovative. This is work that's been done for decades. But I'd say it's innovative right now in my field, right? So it's getting a lot of attention right now in the homelessness and housing research realm. And I'm sure that's probably true of other research topics that I'm less familiar with. And I also think that even if this isn't necessarily, I hesitate to call, it's not an innovation, it's an innovation maybe in my field, but we want to pay tribute to all of this work, all of this participatory action research work that's come before, and that's really been driven by BIPOC scholars, queer scholars, right? Scholars with disabilities, et cetera, right? It's innovative in new field. It's innovative in certain fields now, like homelessness and housing research. And I think it's going to feel really innovative for a lot of us who are early in our careers as researchers because of that dominant model of doing research independently. And I think it's important. And what I really want to highlight today is some of the like best practices I've learned along the way. But so here I feel like it's very innovative in like the homelessness space, right? It's like new to the homelessness space. We're doing it at the homelessness hub at UC San Diego. For those of you familiar with UCSF Benioff, they're really invested in working with lived experience researchers as well and advisors. But so while I would say, well, I really want to be respectful and admit it's not innovative, it's maybe innovative in my homelessness space as a homelessness researcher, and it's going to feel innovative to us all. I would like to spend a little bit of time this afternoon talking about best practices for research justice. So what are some of like the biggest lessons that I've learned working with the Hart Fellows at the Homelessness Hub? I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to give you all, especially knowing that you're new to public scholarship, I'm going to then move into how I did it when I was a grad student and had a lot less resources. So thinking about lessons learned from the Hart Fellowship, where I had more time to work with people with lived experience of homelessness, where I had more resources to pay them for more hours and for a longer duration of time. I want to review some of the best practices for research justice that I have discussed directly with my Hart Fellows. So best practice number one, and this is again, in a better case or best case scenario where you have a lot of resources, at your disposal to work with a team, and not just one individual or two individuals. Ensure that you have a diversity of researchers with lived experience. So thinking about our topic of homelessness, there are multiple perspectives that need to be at the table. BIPOC individuals experiencing homelessness, LGBTQ plus individuals experiencing homelessness, older adults experiencing homelessness, people who have lived in their vehicles, people who have lived unsheltered in a tent, people who've used shelters. They're all bringing different expertise that we need at the homelessness hub. And so again, in a best case scenario, we have a lot of resources. I encourage you to think about what a diversity of researchers with lived experience would look like around your topic. So another best practice that we have highlighted through reflection on our fellowship is that researchers with lived experience should be embedded at every stage of research. So this is from implementation, this is from design, like thinking about the idea, like what are we even setting out to study, to project design, to data collection, data analysis, and the writing up of our findings and dissemination strategies. This is a really big one for our Heart Fellows because some of my Heart Fellows have been involved in other projects where they've been asked to come in and essentially rubber stamp like a completed survey. And as happy as they've been to be present for that conversation and to have their expertise acknowledged, it still didn't feel quite right to them that another group of experts created a survey, like created the research question, created the survey to answer the question, and then just asked them to come in and assess it, as opposed to having them there at the ground level. So again, ideally, if you're doing this kind of innovative work in public scholarship where you're really working with the public now, those most impacted by your issue, time and money permitting, it is ideal to work with your lived experience experts from start to finish in a project. And I'll say this has major consequences for the quality of the research. Working with our Heart Fellows, they have improved everything. They've improved their thoughts on what even needs to be studied, their thoughts on how we should sample, their thoughts on dissemination strategies, their ability to analyze data has brought richer layers to the projects that I'm working on with them than could have been possible without them. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to keep going. So the third best practice that we've learned through the Heart Fellowship is to ensure adequate and commensurate compensation. So as I said, we compensated our Heart Fellows at the level of graduate students, just acknowledging their expertise, but that they're coming in to be trained for like a graduate student, like learning how to do research. And so thinking through how we want to institutionalize this fellowship, this is like really part-time work now, which works for certain people who need just a part-time job. A lot of our Heart Fellows are on disability and only need part-time hours. In fact, more hours will affect their benefits. But looking to kind of like scale up what we do with our Heart Fellowship, we would like to then have not just like cost of living raises, but also, step raises like you get when you're going through grad school or like you're advancing in your expertise. And then we also would really like to move into full-time options, but it's just very challenging right now with the funding landscape. Best practice number 4 is ensure that all researchers are valued. So we worked really hard to do this in our Heart Fellowship. We would have regular weekly meetings during the year-long training. And during those trainings, we would make sure it was clear that it was a bi-directional exchange of knowledge. So we would create activities where our Heart Fellows were kind of running the show and sharing their expertise, for example, on the service ecosystem in San Diego. And they were running that portion of the meeting for us. And then myself and my colleague who co-ran the Heart Fellowship, then would come in and like talk about how do you do trauma-informed interviews, right? Because that's just something we've learned in our PhD programs. And so making sure that there's this sense that all of our expertise is being valued was something that we embedded in our weekly meetings. So that when we moved into going out into the field together and doing projects, we had really built that community, that trust, and that understanding that we are all a group of experts moving into the field together to do our research projects. Best practice number 5 is do not limit expertise to just lived expertise. So a huge lesson learned from doing the Heart Fellowship is just the plethora of knowledge that our Heart Fellows brought to the table, not just lived expertise because they've experienced homelessness and they've gone through the homelessness ecosystem, but they had different degrees they were drawing on, different professions they were drawing on, from before they experienced homelessness to after they experienced homelessness. We had Heart Fellows that ran drug rehabilitation programs prior to experiencing homelessness. We have Heart Fellows that came to run like housing for people emerging from homelessness, like transitional housing programs. We have somebody who's a creative writer who ended up becoming really important for like writing up our reports. So there's just a lot of different expertise that will exist in your lived experience experts beyond just their lived experience. And then finally, for a best practice here, I also just really encourage you to think about engaging universal design. So with the limitations of funding and not being able to offer full-time work at this time, we did try to at least engage in universal design in other ways where we're giving everyone what they need to participate in the fellowship. And so in San Diego County, our Heart Fellows kind of live throughout the county. So we made meetings hybrid if people couldn't drive down the hour to our meeting in La Jolla, where UC San Diego is. We were very flexible in thinking about people's medical appointments or their other work, and when they can or can't come to our meetings or when we were going out into the field. And just giving people a chance to kind of like work offline when they're able to work. Just like elements of universal design go a long way to showing everybody that they're valued and that you want them to participate. So recognizing that a lot of you are really new to public scholarship, and maybe you want to get started with like this kind of innovation, but maybe it's an innovation in your topic and in your realm, and you want to start thinking about how you could really not just talk to community partners like nonprofits and get their perspective on what you should be researching, but you really want to start doing research with folks who are most directly impacted by your topic. There's hope for getting started if you're just a grad student or a postdoc like myself, or assistant professor, and you feel like your time and your resources are very limited. Or there's, I'm going to share some things that I did when I had a lot less time and a lot less resources. So when I did this project in grad school, where I only had 3 months to work with people with lived experience of homelessness, and I only had so much money that I could give them. These are some of the things that I did to make this work, even though there's much more limited time and resources. So I still did pay everybody at the graduate student level. It's actually, I was able to do that with the amount of money I had. And I was able to pay people, I think, like part-time for those months. But I just had upfront transparency, right? This is a 3-month project, part-time work opportunity. But here are the benefits of participating. I also specifically advertised just to advocacy groups for folks who have experienced homelessness, because I felt like this could just be mutually beneficial, where they could build up their skills in like new skills in research could help them with their advocacy, and then all this advocacy they're already doing could really help us think through like the project that we wanted to do together. So when we first met, we also made sure our first meeting was an icebreaker where we got to know each other, asked each other why we were interested in like collaborating in research. I also paid people up front in one lump sum, which I feel, when it's only 3 months and it's only part-time, I think that was really helpful, that I just was like, here's the stipend. Like I would get a stipend as a graduate student. And I really asked people to not work over their hours, right? So once your hours are done, I didn't want to exploit anyone's labor. And then I asked people what they wanted to do. So in this is my experiment, because it was the first time I ever did this work with lived experience researchers. We co-created the project. So I literally asked people what they wanted to study, and we came to a consensus. But then I also just asked people like what they wanted to work on, right? With limited time, knowing that everyone might not be able to do the research from implementation to dissemination, I really wanted to get a sense of what people were most jazzed about. And so if it was interviewing people, that's what I wanted them to spend their hours on. If it was making the interview guide, that's what I wanted them to spend their hours on. If it was talking to the directors of nonprofits, right, to gain the access because they really wanted to like meet these people, that's what I wanted them to spend their hours on. I still embedded paid trainings. I just only did 3. I just tried to do 3 really thoughtful ones, so that I was taking some of the things I learned in grad school and transmitting them just as they were transmitting so much of their information to myself. So I did one on like conducting interviews. I did one on op-ed writing that I learned from Scholar Strategy Network. And then I had my dissertation chair come in and do one on grant writing, because it's something that, knowing they were all advocates, they really wanted to know how to write their own grants for the future. Whether that was to do their own research with their organization or just to like start their own nonprofit or whatever. And I still held weekly meetings just to create structure, which was really helpful. I will say a huge lesson learned is when you're really, really strapped for time doing this work, this is directly from conversations with my Hart Fellows, embedding some structure is super helpful. And we experimented with making that democratic. But when it came down to getting some of the research stuff done, it was really helpful if I would just make some kind of structure for our weekly meetings, to just keep us on task and to get to stay on task for the week. Okay, so that's innovation number 1 that I wanted to talk about today. And then in terms of innovation number 2, I want to talk about the fact that in this current moment, evidence-based best practices, at least in my topic, homelessness and housing, are under attack. And this isn't just something I'm seeing with like the federal government. This is something I'm seeing within the California government as well. So I, for example, have had some off the record conversations with California legislative staffers. And I've just heard a lot about how some of these evidence-based best practices that are born out of years of research are actually not resonating anymore with anybody, not Democrats, not Republicans. It's like a bipartisan rejection of evidence-based best practices right now, essentially. And as I've heard like my Hart Fellows say, and as an important person in the homelessness space, org co-founder and CEO Ian DeJong said, when I saw him like 2 years ago at a local homelessness conference, we're essentially losing the narrative war. So in this current context, and this is not just right happening around homelessness research. But this is happening kind of just around research in general, where there's a lot of skepticism about research, where there's a lot of skepticism about experts, where there's a lot of emphasis on like dominant narrative and like feeling about certain topics like homelessness. Public scholarship might need to shift its approach, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, when I got started with public scholarship, moving from working with the public, right, to taking that research and making a public impact and informing policy, I did things like engage policymakers. I did things like engage the news, right, or write an op-ed. But I'm just hearing over and over again that in this moment, this just might not be as helpful an approach anymore, right? That you could try to talk to a policymaker at the local level, at the state level, share your research, and it just might not be effective if they're convinced from the dominant narrative that like really this is the problem. So making it concrete with what I do in homelessness research, there is this dominant narrative that has been around for a long time, and it's just really kind of gaining force again that everyone experiencing homelessness in California is addicted to drugs and alcohol. They want to live outside, right? They don't want to come inside. They don't want to use shelters. And this dominant narrative is really kind of pushing policies at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level right now. Policies that go against what have actually been shown to be evidence-based best practices, right? So there's been a real crackdown on people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, like a criminalization of that population, because of this dominant narrative, when actually researchers have like a body of research has shown that when you do that, you're really not solving homelessness. You're just kind of pushing people around. You're exacerbating their misery. They're just going to move into these out of the way places. That's going to make it harder for service providers to find them. So it's just this moment where it's like evidence-based best practices and research is paling in comparison to people's thoughts about a dominant narrative. And so thinking about losing like this narrative war, I think that public scholarship is going to need to like get a little creative, right? So I don't mean to put you, I didn't know where everyone was in their level of experience in public scholarship. But if it's not necessarily enough anymore to maybe write an op-ed, or try to go to city council and share your research, because your research isn't going to feel compelling to people if it doesn't change the dominant narrative. If that isn't going to work, right, what might we have to do in terms of like engaging in narrative work, right? So again, with like my homelessness work and making this a little bit more concrete for you all in the audience, if researchers have like not just their research, but a body of other historical research before them, kind of showing like, hey, when you criminalize homelessness, this actually doesn't solve the issue, and it makes things actually kind of worse for people. But like your demonstration of your evidence isn't enough, and it seems like we might be in this moment where we need to like shift narrative.